Thank you for this opportunity to speak to you. We've heard plenty about continued progress in the energy transition from our speakers before, but I'm here today to bring things back to the elephant in the room. Something big, perhaps a little awkward to talk about, yet central to the conversations that we're having today. And that elephant is, quite literally at this point, the return of the Republican Party, conveniently symbolized by an elephant, to power in Washington, D.C., in both houses of Congress and in the White House, bringing with them some continuities from the Biden administration, a focus on reshoring supply chains, on energy security, and on competition with China, but with new emphasis, less on the energy transition, more on fossil fuels and domestic American resources. But this comes with a wide variety of different, sometimes conflicting objectives: affordability, exports, and more. And that brings us a complex phenomenon that we're going to have to take several different perspectives to fully understand. We're best guided by another story about elephants, the parable of the blind men and the elephant. You've probably heard this story. Several blind men walk up to an elephant. One touches the trunk, thinks he's holding a snake. One touches the leg, thinks they're dealing with a tree. One holds the tail, thinking it's a rope. Only by bringing these different perspectives together can they understand the whole phenomenon that is the elephant. And similarly, I'm going to take you through a few different perspectives today on energy, supply chains, old and new technologies to help us understand the overall elephant in our room today. And of course, that starts with observing the behavior of that elephant, such as 100 days ago today, President Trump charging in with a series of executive orders meant to reset the global policy priorities the U.S. pursues, not only pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords once again, as he had promised on the campaign trail, but also trying to withdraw funds and regulatory support, including permits and licenses, from intermittent renewables, the workhorse wind and solar that's been driving the energy transition so far, while accelerating permitting and offering other support to fossil fuels, power transmission, and key baseload or dispatchable electricity technologies like bioenergy, hydropower, nuclear, and geothermal. Now, one could have questioned how much these presidential memoranda and executive orders would mean, but soon afterwards, President Trump attempted to establish dominance via his energy dominance agenda over the entirety of the federal bureaucracy. Through his presidential advisor Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, we saw huge cuts not only to funding from federal agencies like the Department of Energy, but also major changes to the staffing necessary to run those programs, with major changes not only to uncommitted funding, but to contractually obligated grants and loans. We face a very different energy financing landscape for projects than we did a few months ago when the Loan Programs Office was racing to complete its contracts. All of this, of course, was only a prelude for the word that everybody's expecting and nobody has said yet: tariffs. Everyone and everything getting tariffed. As a little recap, of course, this started with Canada getting 10% on energy and mineral products and 25% on everything else. Then Mexico, 25% on everything flat, 25% on steel and aluminum, stacking with those previous tariffs, 25% on autos and auto parts. It is a true tariff bonanza. And all of this is, of course, a mere prelude to Liberation Day. Does that feel like a long time ago to you? It does to me. 10% baseline tariffs on every product imported to the U.S., except what we just talked about, with higher rates for a wide variety of products globally, a wide variety of countries, suspended for now for a little bit less than 90 days, with rotating negotiations happening as we speak. And China still has 145% tariffs on almost all of its products, even as everything else is paused. Now, obviously, this is all intended to rewire the global trading order, bring the U.S. more advantages, bring factories back home. But the reality is, despite the intent, this is going to kill a lot of projects. In fact, it already has. Here's one. Core Power, a battery manufacturer, had received a conditional commitment from the Loan Programs Office to set up a new plant in Arizona. That conditional commitment being paused by DOGE, Core Power realized it couldn't support it, and that factory, its jobs, its production is gone. It's not happening. It's not just a question of manufacturing. There's more basic things to the function of the energy system that are being affected by these. Consider, for example, batteries. Even if you don't care about the energy transition, these have critical roles in resilience, grid services, power price balancing, and more. But the U.S. gets the vast majority of its batteries from China. This is our prediction of how many batteries will be installed in the U.S. over the next 10 years without tariffs. Here's what we're seeing with 54% tariffs. And keep in mind, this was done before we hit 145% on Chinese imported batteries. Less installation, a less resilient power system. But to bring it back to the manufacturing goals of the Trump administration, you could certainly say there's an advantage to making U.S.-made batteries more price competitive with China's. Yet, in reality, we're seeing that factories are facing a hard time in the U.S., not just core power, but generally. From 2024 to 2025, BNEF cut its expectation for factory investment by 3/4, from $42 billion to $13 billion. That's not a purely policy story. Global overcapacity and competition makes it tough, but certainly policy instability, input cost rises, and an uncertain macroeconomic outlook, to say nothing of uncertain subsidies, don't help. But you could point out many of these factories might have struggled to compete anyway. Why not do what the administration wants us to do and focus on its comparative advantages for the U.S., oil and gas? As we're probably all familiar, the U.S. was by far the largest single source of global supply increase for oil over the last 10 years, and it's projected to be by far the largest new supplier of new LNG to the global market over the next 5. So perhaps the U.S. should embrace oil and gas as an alternative for its global economic competitiveness. The U.S. should, as the president said in his inauguration, drill, baby, drill. But while the U.S. has a lot of comparative advantages here, there are some limitations to this over the near term and the long term. In the near term, we can see some complicated graphs here that have a very simple meaning. The more positive the number here, the more the global oil market is oversupplied. With downgraded macroeconomic outlook for the next year, based partly on tariffs being imposed and cutting demand, we see the world tipping more into oversupply. That is to say, oil will be cheaper and less valuable as an export. And over the longer term, we know, according to BNEF's modeling, that in an economic transition scenario, in a purely cost-based system, the market is not going to grow the oil demand that much. We're going to see a plateau in the 2030s, followed by a decline that could move even faster if EVs are adopted faster or if policy is more aggressive, as we see in the dotted line representing our net zero scenario. Gas, on the other hand, is a different story. There's quite a lot of potential for global demand growth, driven in part by AI data centers and by fuel switching throughout the world. It's much lower in a net zero scenario, but we're assuming that we're going with the economic transition one. If that does happen, though, there's quite a lot of uncertainty about what the formal global demand will be. There's about 1,500 billion cubic centimeters of difference by 2050 between the highest and lowest projections across modelers. With that much uncertainty, it perhaps makes sense for the U.S. to have a few more eggs in its basket of global exports and competitiveness than oil and gas alone. Which raises a question. If the U.S. is having trouble competing in the technologies of the present, intermittent renewables like wind and solar, and if there's limitations to the technologies of the past, like oil, can the U.S. reinvent itself, reinvent the elephant, so to speak? Can it embrace some emerging climate technologies or energy technologies like hydrogen, carbon capture, and sustainable materials, which will only see their markets grow as investor preferences and Europe's carbon border adjustment mechanism create larger markets? Well, the U.S. has some efforts in that regard already. The Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations has key grants, for example, for industrial demonstrations of low-carbon sustainable materials, ones that provide critical offtake for carbon capture and hydrogen, to say nothing of the loan programs office's many different loans for manufacturing and innovative technologies. But as you might recall, those got doged. And with the pause, we are seeing an uncertain future for those energy technologies as well, an uncertainty about whether the U.S. can compete in those global spaces. But let's take a step back here. Ultimately, what is the point of energy policy? Is it jobs? Is it exports? I would submit to you that it's different. Energy is the fundamental input of the economy, everything from data centers to factories to hospitals. What it needs to be is as reliable, as secure, and as all-in cheap, socially as well as economically, in terms of public health, in terms of climate damages. That's what you really need from the energy system. And the market, among other things, has spoken that this energy system going forward in the U.S. is going to be led by renewables. If you look at the interconnection queues, the backlog of generation that needs to be connected to the grid, the vast majority of it is solar, storage, and to a lesser extent, wind. Everything else is considerably lower, and while we'll see higher capacity factors for gas and potentially coal as baseload demand grows, ultimately load growth, what we need to meet the data center, the manufacturing, the economic growth challenge is going to be met by renewables above all else. And critically, we need a supportive policy regime for that. These were BNEF's projections for what combined wind, solar, and storage build would be as of 2024. It's a bit different now. We have a clean energy market outlook today where you can see our current projections. This is what it would look like without energy tax credits from the Inflation Reduction Act, a 17% net drop across the three categories of wind, solar, and storage, even higher in some sectors like wind. In other words, it's critical that there be policy stability to keep this energy transition going and growing. Fortunately, the tax credits probably aren't going away. As you can see in this chart, Inflation Reduction Act investment, both public and private, has overwhelmingly gone to Republican states and districts like Wyoming, Alaska, North Dakota, Texas, Indiana, and Kentucky. And with these benefits, we're seeing members of the House and Senate, legislators who actually matter for changing the law, coming out to defend the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits, asking at least to make sure that any changes are organic and smooth and don't threaten existing projects. But the devil is in the details. There are potential changes to domestic sourcing requirements, Chinese exclusions, and to the phase out of the credits, which can make a major difference to the actual deployment of energy and the actual ability to meet these demand growth challenges. In other words, with so much uncertain, we're all still a little bit like the blind men feeling out the elephant. And with midterms coming up in a little bit under 2 years, there's plenty more detail to try and feel out. Thank you.